Good morning. Um, my name is Aaron Stritzel. Today is Thursday, November 5th. Thank you all for those who are joining us this morning. As we begin, I want to invite you to share with me if you're watching. Let me know that you're watching, and also let me know where you have found beauty, truth, and goodness in the world, where you have seen hope or found inspiration. And gosh, that's a good question. I haven't thought it through, even though I'm asking you all. Good morning, Mary. Good morning. Let me know you're watching. Share where you've seen beauty, truth, and goodness in the world, where you found hope. We still don't know the presidential outcome, so it's been a week, which feels like it's a typical 2020 presidential election season. With everything else that's going on in 2020, of course, we would be sitting in this limbo season with everything else as well. So, So today, as you guys share, I want to talk about this idea of a bias towards the bottom. I think we'll probably just jump right in. So today's text, if you're following along for our meditation moments, comes from Matthew 25, 34 through 40. Then the king will say to those at his right hand, "Come, you who are blessed by my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me food. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you welcomed me. I was naked, and you gave me clothing. I was sick, and you took care of me. I was in prison, and you visited me." Then the righteous will answer him, "Lord, when was it that we saw you were hungry and gave you food, or thirsty and gave you something to drink? And when was it that we saw you a stranger and welcomed you, or naked and gave you clothing? And when was it that we saw you sick or in prison and visited you?" And the king will answer them, "Truly I tell you, just as you did it to one of the least of these, who are members of my family, you did it to me. Truly I tell you, just as you did it to one of the least of these, who are members of my family, you did it to me." It's interesting how a couple of things. What stands out to you? A couple of things that stand out to me. First of all, this is a challenging text, and it, I think, should be, especially for those of us who live in a pretty affluent area and a pretty affluent nation. But here, first of all, Jesus likens their acts that they did to others, especially the least of those on the bottom, as if they were doing them unto him. It's also interesting that they were shocked about it. Like, we get into this kingdom because we did these things. In this parable, God invites people into the kingdom not based on their beliefs, but on how they treated the poor, the marginalized, and those that are on the bottom. Yes.
Hey, sorry, Roman.
No worries.
Has it always sputtered like that?
Is that
So that's the flame.
Oh.
So, but when it comes on, it's like it just goes.
Oh.
And it's doing that now.
I haven't noticed. Yeah.
Okay, I just wanted to ask because it's not normal, but it's working. But and then I have the cover off, so maybe that's why you've never heard it.
Yeah.
But
okay, it probably is. That's probably why. Because I mean, it sounds like a really loud version of what it normally sounds like. So.
And that's just because the cover's off. I mean, it's supposed to just be
and smooth.
And it's just like.
Huh.
It's weird. Okay.
Yeah.
I haven't seen anyone do that, so I'll find out here. Why?
Okay. Enzo, come here. Thank you. Sorry for that interruption. We're getting our furnace looked at. So, where was I? So in seminary, they introduced us to different forms of theology. And one specific class that we learned about theology from the margins. We also learned about ethics from the margins. It's basically how different people are more marginalized, or who have been more marginalized, have understood God and God's activity in the world. This included things like Black theology, gay theology, women's theology, liberation theology. How do people in different parts and different areas of the world see and understand God and God's activity in the world? I was actually first introduced to liberation theology from my wife, Molly, who's always been passionate about social justice, helping people have access to things like healthcare, education, food, clean water. Liberation theology is this idea that God has a preferential option for the poor. Some call it a bias towards the bottom. It began to take root in Latin America, where people were fighting for economic justice, for their livelihoods, as they're reading this book we call the Bible. These books we call the Bible, these stories, they inspired them and found a hope in them. And that's where we get the word liberation, or the phrase liberation theology. I was raised actually in the evangelical church in America, which is a distinct way of looking at God and the world that is shaped both by evangelicalism and American values and worldview. I will never forget when I became to become more aware of my own views of God. It was dressed that and become aware that my views of God were shaped, yes, from the Bible, but also all these other lenses, specifically my own cultural context. Molly and I spent 3 months in England on a large mission trip, mission base for YWAM, Youth of a Mission, if you know that. So that housed over 100 people from all over the world. We were part of a schooling called the DTS, Discipleship Training School. And there's, I think, 11 of us, again, from all over the world. And each week they brought in a different speaker, and there was a different theme and a different focus. So we were kind of introduced to different perspectives from people who lived all over. It was interesting to be in such a setting as a married couple, because we encountered all these different views. For example, we would go over to somebody's house who lived on the mission base, and they would have several bottles of wine out for dinner for people. And then we would eat dinner with another family a couple days later, where their background in kind of Christian culture, the views of alcohol meant it was very taboo to drink, so they didn't have it around. And then a few nights later, we would go out to a pub with some of the young adults there, and then a few days later, we'd connect with somebody who felt like that was wrong. So we're figuring all this out. Another example, we talked about the war in Iraq, which was going on from a Christian standpoint, but it became clear that there were so many different views represented based on where people lived and how they experienced the war. For some, the war was just. For others, war was never just. And for others, this war in particular was an expression from their view of a superpower flexing its muscles, and they experienced it as coercive from their standpoint. So while looking back is great, I struggled a lot in such a context. But it drastically shaped the way I see the world, especially it made me more aware that my Christian lenses have also been shaped by my culture, not just my faith. There's a cultural connection there. Liberation theology comes from a very different culture than ours. And that's, I think it has much to teach us if we can open ourselves up to that. Because our own theology, technically probably like theologies, our own ways of understanding God and God's activity in the world, whether or not we're always aware of them, have been shaped by our culture and our experience. And there's so many different levels to that that we can't touch on really here. But liberation theology proposes to fight poverty by addressing its alleged source. It's the sin of greed or power. And in doing so, it creates this relationship between Christian theology and spirituality, and also sort of political activism in the world. You could say its reflection is, how do we bring God's kingdom here in a sort of a real, tangible way? It does critique the overemphasis of much of American theology, which focuses on the individual, and suggests that we miss the point when it becomes primarily about people's individual sins and salvation. Yeah. I'll be honest and say it took me a while to be open to liberation theology, since my upbringing taught me to see sin as an individual thing, to see salvation as an individual mindset. Yet, as I learned, which I continue to do, I began to recognize the Bible actually speaks much more about sin and salvation in communal aspects than it ever really does about the individual. Actually, most of the Bible is actually focused on this. The story of Exodus, which is the formational story of the Hebrew people, is all about a group of people who experienced injustice as they were enslaved in the hands of the world's superpower. Greed and power are the central sins of this story. Liberation is the theme. Once saved, another word we can use is liberated, then they met God in the desert, where God basically gave them a list of instructions on how to be human in the new world they found themselves. The common theme that undergirds all of these instructions really is how not to be overcome with greed and power, thus treat the poor, those at the bottom, with disdain or unjust power, because they want to make sure they're always being taken care of, always being looked after. In other words, basically, now that you're liberated, make sure that you don't become the thing that enslaved you. And as we read through the story, what we see is that indeed they struggled from time to time as a nation. And they began to develop resources that they struggled. They got off track. They did mistreat the poor, the marginalized. In the Hebrew scriptures, often they refer to it as the poor, the widow, the orphan. These are those who are at the bottom of their society. The poor that were liberated from a greedy empire became a greedy empire, at least at times. This is where the Old Testament prophets come in to remind God's people that while worship is important, how we treat the poor, those on the bottom, is the greatest reflection of God's kingdom, or whether or not we're living into that on earth. So we worship so that God's heart seeps into us. But we see the change by our actions in the life, specifically how we treat those, especially those on the bottom, because it seems that through the biblical story, God hears the cries of those who are on the bottom. God's ears tuned into those cries. As I began to look at biblical story with new lenses, I began to see liberation theology not in just some places, but central to the story, the whole overarching story. In Mark 10, there's a story of two disciples coming up to Jesus and asking to be great in this new kingdom. Jesus, sensing the greed and their desire for power, tells them that to be great means to be the servant of all. And then says that for human one, quoting from Mark 10:45, for the human one didn't come to be served, but rather to serve and to give his life to liberate many people. The very reason Jesus came here, he says, is to bring about liberation. Now, liberation means both individual and social. I think Methodism, we tend to emphasize both. We stand in that middle. It's not an either or, but it's a both and. However, I do think that in America, most of Christians, in my experience, have been trained to see it primarily or exclusively through an individual lens. Yes, Jesus came to teach us about individual salvation, individual liberation, but the reality is, which we see from today's text, is that our own liberation, salvation, is tied to the liberation, salvation of others. We can't really separate that, which is really difficult for those of us, I think, raised in a more individualistic culture to really get a hold of, to really grasp, and to really comprehend. But it's such a big deal to Jesus that when he talks about entering into the kingdom after death, he says that the guiding principle in this text will be how you treat the least of those on the bottom of society. For that is how you treated Christ. It's powerful and it should be challenging. Let's be honest, it's often difficult for us to grasp this. Why? Because it's so different from the way we're taught in Western American culture. It's subversive. Yet if we're willing to grow, and I think that's a huge part of faith, is we're constantly being invited to grow, to expand, to be a part of what God is doing, which is the unfolding work happening all around us, then I think we'll begin to see this more and more. But one of the greatest obstacles we face in really putting this into practice is that we actually live in the most powerful nation that has ever been known in the wealthiest, most powerful nation. The temptation, which I think every group faces, is to become blind, unaware, and not intentionally. Just we, like fish, we're swimming in that. We just don't see it, unconscious to the ways that greed and power might shape our worldview. And thus we become blind to the way the poor, those at the bottom, are treated. So lots of stuff here. Watching from Kenya. Thank you all for joining. That's great. What does it look like? For example, this means that it's easy for us to buy clothes without caring where they were made, who made them, or what conditions the work environment is. It's a kingdom principle. This means it's easy for us who live in America to buy food without thinking about how it might impact someone living South America or somewhere else. It means it's easy for us to become unaware of the growing medium house price here in Durango, in our states, and how less and less middle, lower class people can afford to live here. This means that it's easy for us to become unaware of how our skin color, gender, sexual identity has lent itself, given us more opportunities than others. I'll be honest and say that someone who checked off all of these, what some people call privilege boxes, just means that you don't have things to overcome. As a white cisgender male, I have less to overcome than anybody else. This has increasingly been challenging, and I think probably should. Otherwise, I don't think I'm living more deeply into the kingdom of God. Hello.
This is the quick signature, sorry.
Oh, sure. I'll be right back.
So we couldn't get a hold of Linda, so we're gonna have to come back to do the servicing on the hot water heater.
Okay.
The tankless water heater.
Okay.
And then, do you guys have filters at all here?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so I'll break some of those as well.
Perfect.
Okay. And then, what's your best contact number?
970-403-4048.
Okay, perfect. So I'll give you a call whenever she picks up, and it's AA.
Yep.
Okay.
All right.
All right. Awesome. Thank you. Yep. You're welcome.
Enzo, stay here. All right. Anyway, sorry about that. Where was I? I think it's probably more difficult, more challenging living in 21st century America, because we live in sort of empire. Not to say that's wrong. It's just easy for us to be blind, to not be aware of how all these decisions are impacting us, the environment, and everything else. Hopefully that's the point I was getting at. Who knows where I was and all that rambling. And I'll end with this. I'm sorry about the interruptions today. It's 2020. What are you going to do? As people of faith, injustice should matter to us. Like Jesus, I think we're all called to serve and to give our lives to help liberate many people. It's going to look different for each of us. It's going to look different in different seasons of our lives. It's going to look different in COVID. It's going to look different depending on our age. Are we working? Are we retired? Do we have kids? All of these things look different. But I think the question then we wrestle, how do we live not just for ourselves, but for others? There is this big story, this big movement that we are invited to be a part of, not just about us. I'm going to talk this weekend about moving from me to we. It's a different understanding, a different paradigm of understanding that our actions, individual, have an effect on others. And that it's been said that our liberation is tied up into the liberation of others, that our salvation is tied up into the salvation of others, that we do a disservice, especially in American Christianity, when we focus almost exclusively on, do you believe the right things and are you going to have an individual salvation, instead of what are you doing to bring God's kingdom to earth? That every time we feed somebody, every time we give somebody water, every time we reach out, every time we serve somebody, every time we moved recently and people brought us gift cards for food. That's the kind of thing that Jesus is talking about. So like the text for today says, we spend time with those who are poor. And when we do, when we do spend time with those who are a different socioeconomic class, as we do, we become more aware of our own biases and our own privileges. Not saying it's wrong. We just become more aware. Oh, I've been blessed to live in this place. I had two parents. Whatever those might be, and we realize those things. Then we partner together with people of all different socioeconomic classes to work for the liberation of all. So hopefully, hopefully that made sense in the midst of all the interruptions of everything that's going on today. But the gist that I want to hit home is this idea that liberation theology suggests that God's ear is specifically open to those who are in pain and suffering, who don't have a voice, who are struggling. So what are we doing to partner with them? What are we doing to hear them? Because according to the text today, it's absolutely essential. So yes, thank you all for joining me. Sorry again about all the interruptions. It was great to be with you all. If anything else stood out to you, feel free to share and do those things. Ron, it's good to see you on here as well. Thomas, thanks for joining. Jill, great to see you. I hope you all have a good rest of your day. And we'll see you tomorrow at 9 a.m.